Thank you all for, I'll start that again. Thank you all for joining us. This is the ACE Media Relations and Writing Learning Community, and today we're having a Writing Circle Coffee Chat. Our host today is Julie Stricker, a Public Information Officer with University of Alaska Fairbanks Cooperative Extension Service and an ACE member. She has more than 30 years of copy editing and reporting experience at a number of newspapers and other publications in Florida and Alaska. Julie has won awards for reporting, layout, and design, and she's leading our writing circle for anybody that wants to chat. And Julie, I'm just going to turn it over to you at this point.
Okay. Listening to you guys in the last meeting that we had talking about the contest, I'm curious, what kind of stories do you write and enter in these? And are they big stories? Do you send them around to each other? What is your process? And what would you like the process to be? Chris, I'm going to put you on the spot.
So last summer, so our office used to be responsible for putting out our agricultural research magazine, and the dean pulled our funding for that because he wanted the College of Ag to produce that magazine. So I don't write for the magazine anymore. So previously I entered a few magazine pieces, although actually, to be honest with you, even before that, the magazine had gone to online only for about a year, or 2 years, I think. So that was something I entered I think I entered one, but I entered it in the writing for web because it was eligible for writing for web. So I don't really write what I call big stories anymore. But what I do, what our news team of 2 here in our Extension Communications office at Oregon State, I'm at Oregon State University. What we've been doing increasingly more in the last year and a half in lieu of news releases is we write news stories, what we call extension news stories. And this was an idea I had because I basically felt like we put a whole lot of work into writing news releases, and then we sent them out to the increasingly smaller media landscape and just hope that it got picked up. And we also, in Extension, we get a lot of tips on really interesting things and cool things that are going on, especially at fair time. So I basically said, well, why don't we write these stories ourselves? Now we're only a team of 2, but we write these news stories. And I've entered a few. I entered a news story last year in CNAs and writing for the web because they're web only. But a few of them we do, I'll send them to like the local paper and basically say, please feel free to use any or all of this. And so that works. The Extension news stories are written in a journalistic format. Both my colleague and I are former newspaper reporters. So basically, yeah, so they basically do that. Or we basically just go with our strengths, is it right? Essentially. So I always explain to the folks when I'm writing the stories that this is something like you would read in a newspaper. It's not a news release style at all. And so when I do send it to the, if sometimes if they're written in a little bit more of a less of a featurey and more journalistic style, I'll send it to the local paper. I just did one the other day that was written in a very, obviously just news feature. They're news features. There's no hard-hitting news. We don't break news with our Extension news stories. Although we do, I think we do. Again, we find out about those neat stories and we write about them, and it's really been a success because those stories so we've been expanding our outreach to legislators, to stakeholders. I shouldn't say expanding, but we've added like a legislative newsletter. And the people who do that, they love those stories. I like calling them impact in real time because a lot of Extension communications offices are responsible for, like ours, basically we convert impact statements into impact stories. And so I love news stories because I don't have to wait until mid-January of every year to get the neat thing that they were working on. I can get it in real time. So it helps. Most of the time that people don't quite understand, they still think it's a news release. Even though I tell them ahead of time it's not a news release, when I send them the link to it, they said, hopefully those get picked up by the media. I don't know, for the few people on this call, we still have people who are still think that being in the media is like the gold standard for us. And I like to say, if we get a good story in front of a key legislator or stakeholder, that's going to be much more much more effective than than it basically being put on a website. So yeah, but I wanted to sort of well, I'll let other people go. I did have a topic I wanted to talk about, but I'll let the other people go first.
Okay. Anne, do you have anything to say just in case you do disappear?
Yeah. Well, so a lot of I write stories mostly about research, although it depends on what's going on. I have to do other stories sometimes, but that's my primary focus, both for the College of Agriculture and Life Sciences here at Iowa State University, and for the Iowa Nutrient Research Center here. So a lot about water quality. I've been here for just over 3 years, and they don't do as much of an effort to pitch stories to media, although I've done a lot of that in the past. And so I do some of that. We post all of our stories on our website, and then they go out to a media contacts list. Sometimes they get picked up, actually quite a bit. And then some of the stories that I do a lot of them are kind of news features. I wouldn't really say I don't very often do a straight news release, but sometimes we do for an event or something like that. That they get picked up by, or I also do special pitches to Farm Journal, to Wallace's Farmer, to Successful Farming, sometimes to science news outlets, and to public radio, for example. So really a lot, I felt that a lot of the stories that I do and don't fit into the categories all that well for like Q&A awards. But we also do stories for a magazine, or kind of like an alumni magazine here, but we're not sure that's going to continue due to cutbacks. And so if that's the case, probably I'll have even less opportunity to do things that fit neatly into the critiques and awards process.
Okay. Jay Stewart, I don't think I've met you. Or not.
I think that's a colleague of mine at Iowa State.
Oh,
Listening in.
okay. Oh, okay. I'm not hooked up to the camera. Okay. No worries. I don't like being on camera anyway. So as far as not peer reviews, but among ourselves, is there interest in having us read each other's stuff before? Is there even any time to have somebody else read it and look over something?
I'd be up for that. I think it could be a really good and probably get more useful feedback.
Because I can set up a Dropbox and we can just feed things in there. Does everybody have Dropbox? Everybody's using different technology.
Yeah, we use Box at Oregon State as opposed to Dropbox, but for me, we already have so many layers of review. Although the news stories that, like I said, the extension news stories that I talked about, that most of the review is not, it's not peer writers. It's basically it's people who need to know kind of basis, or like on a news release review process. But yeah, I'd be interested because it might lead into the topic that I was curious about.
Yeah, let's hear it.
Plain language. So our office, driven by our publications team, has really gotten into this plain language. And I, of course, many years working for newspapers, I was used to writing for what I consider a sixth grade audience. And people at universities are shocked when they hear that. They can't believe it. They're like, sixth grade audience. And I'm like, yeah, that's what most of when you're a newspaper, that's, at least that was my sixth grade. I've heard eighth grade, I've heard seventh grade.
I've heard fifth.
Fifth, yeah. So it's never really higher than freshman in high school. So, but I've made concessions when I switched to university communications, especially in news releases. It's really, to me, I pride myself on cutting all the jargon, but there are a few times when I have to compromise with faculty who are just don't get it. And so I have to use sometimes words and phrases that are at a senior level of high school or college level. Anyway, but our office has really gotten into this Hemingway app, Hemingway editor. So it's Hemingway. You just type in Hemingway app and it shows up, and you literally copy and paste your piece of writing into it, and it tells you what your readability score is. I can share it if you want. But basically, so we've really gotten into that. Everybody's using the Hemingway app. Well, I've written some of these news stories, and they've gotten a score of like eighth grade or maybe a little bit higher on some of them. And there was one that I wrote from a very, news feature journalistic way. And the person I sent it to, of course, this involved our outreach to Latino communities for vaccination. And so I wrote it, and basically the person who had some commentary on it, he wasn't actually a reviewer, but basically he felt like it was too high of a reading level. I said, well, it scored like eighth grade. And he says, well, among Latinos, it needs to be like fourth grade or fifth grade or whatever. And I just felt, and he also said it read like a New Yorker piece. And I'm like, well, I'm flattered, but
An eighth grade New Yorker piece.
well, first of all, I wrote it in very short sentences and short paragraphs. So I don't know when was the last time he cracked open the New Yorker to see their full page paragraphs.
Yeah.
Anyway, his point was he felt like it was written for like a magazine, like a high level magazine, which it wasn't. So that's been a little bit of a point of frustration for me, that basically people are claiming that our news stories are written at a too high of a grade level. And so but again, I've been out of practice. I've been in university communications now for 8 years. And so like when I was a newspaper reporter, boy, yeah, I really focused on no jargon, short words, short phrases. I like Hemingway because I really did. I mean, I went to the point where I was so obsessed about it. I would look at it in preview mode as the way it would look in the way the paragraphs would look in the columns in the paper. And if a paragraph looked a little too long, I would go, and if there was a widow on the paragraph, I would change it. But when I went to university communications, you make a lot of concessions. You basically go, okay, because this has to get through the review process from both of the source for the faculty and then people, administrators, and they generally are assuming that they want to have more what they consider precise academic language. So that's been a little bit of source. I mean, nobody's saying don't publish that story because it's a too high a grade level. But on the other hand, when I put it in the Hemingway app and it comes out at like 11th grade, I don't go, oh my gosh, this can't be, this is a bad story. So, but like I said, I don't write big stories anymore. Most of the stories I write are in the 800 to 500, 800 word range.
What do you consider a big story? 2000.
Well, that's funny you mentioned that because even when I was in my last years at the paper, I was convinced, although do as I say, not as I do, I was convinced that our story, especially at a paper like mine, I was at the Arkansas Democrat Gazette, and we still had a huge paper. We had a big paper. a weekend story with at 50 to 60 inches was not out of the question.
Oh my
And
gosh.
I know, but I was convinced that our stories were way too long. And it was kind of funny because I used to read both CJR and Editor and Publisher pretty religiously. We got them in the newsroom. And I remember there was a few editors who had retired, and they went and asked them questions about like, what do you see now? What would you do now? What would you change? And almost to a person, they basically said, our stories are too long. And we're not talking about like going to USA Today, but they were just basically saying the stories are too long. So yeah, I'm like, I do have an idea for for what I'm calling big stories. So I'm thinking about ways that we could enhance our website for these stories that are more, because I would like to write these longer or multimedia stories. When I say longer, they could be broken up by video and graphics and stuff like that, because we don't have that. We're under a Drupal program where basically it's just like you throw the stuff in there. There's no room for video and stuff like that. So yeah, my colleague, I don't think I've written 1,000-word story in 8 years. So, and a news release, certainly. I think I maybe touched almost 900 words on a news release once, and I felt like that was 200 words too long.
Well, all of our people that we have like an 8-step process to get a news release out, and they are all former journalists. So,
oh, that's good.
Which helps.
Our review process, the only writer editor types on our review process are like basically the person who reads the review, who does like initial review. Then after that, it's a high level review group. So they don't really have a lot of. So I guess that's a long-winded answer saying maybe I would benefit from having another pair of eyes. But on the other hand, these stories are being published right to the web, and I don't really know. Yeah, I would welcome any kind of critique.
Okay. Yeah, and I would too, because I mean, I'm the only person in my office writing. We have my supervisor, and we have the person who takes care of everything else. So, the more eyes, the better. But
I feel like I get into bad habits and have defaulted to a certain, like all of my writing is like this formula now, and I'm losing that creative edge sometimes, just trying to churn it out and move through the list.
I just signed up for a creative nonfiction writing class next semester. So hopefully, because my mom can always tell my stories. Oh, you wrote this one, even without a byline. I'm like, ooh, that's not good. But hi, Jay Stewart.
Hello.
Hello. So you're at Iowa?
Yes, Iowa State.
Iowa State. Okay. And do you have anything you want to add?
I'm actually participating today from a little different perspective. I don't do very much writing. I do a weekly newsletter where I'm basically kind of curating content from everyone else's writing. And it's becoming more and more common, especially with news releases, that I'm usually 2/3 of my way through before I get to the kind of the who, what, when, where, why, for the 1 or 2 sentences, sometimes 3 sentences that I'm including with the newsletter, and then a link to go to the full news release. And that I have found that to be a very interesting shift from news to stories, overwhelmingly stories.
She's talking about my work now.
No,
Partly.
It's pretty much everything. I mean, everything I see from our extension office, from our different departments, our centers. It's just becoming very common that things are referred to as stories, and I think there's certainly a place for stories. But when I see a news release, probably my expectation is a little more that within the first 2 paragraphs, you can get the gist.
And how long are typical news releases? Our office wants some no more than 350 words for a news release. And then for a
yeah,
story, I
you
can go
know
up to 800 words. Or if I don't send it to them first, I can go over that, but they don't let me do that very often.
You would know that better than I do, Anne.
Yeah, well, so since our writing is primarily for the web, first of all, we're not as careful as we should be. Although personally, I've been working on whittling my stories down. Lots of times they're pretty complicated, and sometimes really complicated stories that I'm trying to translate to the public. Certainly most of them wouldn't qualify for 5th grade. But anyway, I'm interested in this Hemingway app for sure. I think that our stories are usually like around 500 to 900 words. We've been getting them shorter because it used to be that we were regularly going 1,000 or a little over. But lots of times, as their news features, they have subheads that break them up, etc. So, and we always use pictures, of course, sometimes video.
Well, and I
Stacy.
think it's
Oh, sorry.
I think it's also interesting that with the reduction in staff in so many offices, you can also get caught up in just produce. So then the flip side to the really long news releases that are more story oriented is you have short ones that there's really nothing there. You did put something out and different people will see that you put something out, but really kind of what's the story? What's the news?
Yeah. Stacy.
We aren't doing as many type of news releases anymore. We do longer stories for our annual magazine, and then sometimes just because they're kind of fun to write. I have noticed when we put things on our blog site, sorry, my Teams is blowing up with one of my colleagues from ITS, which is our IT department, trying to figure out what's going on with our IT for extension. We use the WordPress app for our news stories, and so they're coming in, they're written by educators. Sometimes we write them, and that is showing us, going back to the plain English thing. Sorry, that's where my mind is kind of stuck and still turning around. And everything I'm getting from all of my educators too is, it's difficult or fairly difficult, and they're getting these red flags in WordPress, and I go and I look at what my student has been uploading and scheduling, and I'm seeing that they're all not in plain English. So thinking a little bit too about how heavy are all of you with editing when your educators send stuff in? And I guess this goes back to you all have a stronger peer review process than we do too. So maybe I need to go to my colleague Bob, who's working on that for us.
I'm editing something right now, and it's somebody who likes to put in parenthetical phrases that don't really do anything. And he's just sending me an email now arguing that this needs to go back in there. And I'm like, so.
Yeah, that's interesting. When I say I make concessions, that's usually after some sort of a compromise. I don't allow, so for instance, on this story I just wrote recently or earlier this week, one of the source reviewers had, and she's not academic faculty, but she had basically added like a full sentence length phrase to the lead, the first sentence. And it even had an acronym in there. And so basically, usually what I do is I just, I politely let them know, basically say, well, this story is written in a journalistic style. and in a journalistic style calls for short sentences and short paragraphs. But what I did was I took her phrase and I put it in, somewhere in the 6th or 7th paragraph. I usually, dealing with faculty is it can be a pleasant experience. I've had very few very unpleasant experiences, like you're talking about. Usually I just sometimes I just concede on something that I basically go, okay, well, you know what, this is not that big a deal. But I really hold firm on, adding, they usually want to add a lot to the first sentence, the lead. They don't understand the concept of lead. They're used to abstracts that have these long first sentences. And it's kind of funny because, the phrase of academic clearing your throat, if you read any abstract to a research paper, and they basically bury the most important thing in the very last sentence of the abstract, or midway through at the very best. They do write them a little bit like impacts, because we get also, our faculty turn in impact statements. Now in their defense, that's the way the impact formula is set up, that basically you have the problem, the action, solution. I remember when I first started here, I had never worked in extension, so I didn't know what an impact was. And they tasked me with updating some impact stories on our website. And I had basically, thankfully I didn't get very far along, but I probably 3 or 4 stories I had basically turned them upside down, because I was like, this is driving me nuts. Why is the results in the last paragraph? And well, that's because it's set up, and I've been submitting to the National Land Grant website, and it really frustrates me that that's like the last thing. It's like the news is in the last thing, but that's how they do it. But that's set up for academic, National Land Grant site, that's set up for that. So, but yeah, the academic clearing your throat. So I usually have to, now news release, thankfully they're a little bit, and they understand it more, they at least understand it. Well, some of them do, most of them do. But with the news story, I think I have gotten, as was mentioned previously, I probably have gotten out of the practice of the what we call the high five. So I was in the Democratic Gazette, the news, context, impact, background, basically that kind of stuff, trying to get that, I've been writing these news stories, and this last one I wrote, it was, the nut graph was pretty far down. So because it was written in a featurey way, but that doesn't mean even in a feature you don't bury the nut graph. You should still have that within, the idea is you got to get that nut graph, before the jump, so to speak. So I don't deal with any of that stuff anymore. I don't think about before the jump. I don't think about how the paragraph is going to look. Now, on the other hand, I do, when I do see it like in Drupal and see the paragraph, I still, after 30 years of writing in a journalistic style, I could, I know when a paragraph is too long. I know when a sentence is too long. And so, but I do get out of the habit, I have gotten out of the habit of short sentences, because sometimes they lard the edits with commas and parenthetical phrases, drive me nuts. They always were doing. My colleague, she writes a lot about gardening, and she likes to put in the scientific names of the flowers, the bushes, the trees, and I don't really see the use for that. But she basically said, well, it's because this is the specific species of this flower or bush or whatever. And I just don't, but I concede on it. I basically go, okay. I usually use the audience as a guide. I basically say, will the audience get why this scientific phrase is in here? And she says, yeah. And I say, okay. Because audience for me is always like the king. You always want to think about what the audience, what the reader is going to, what the reader is going to think. That's unfortunately the biggest schism between us and the faculty we work on with research articles and news releases. They think we're writing for their colleagues. They want to take the link and send it to their colleague. And if it's written in a way that doesn't have, they basically think it should be written like a research paper. And, but I usually just, I just basically just sort of try to use a charm offensive. I don't get nasty unless they get nasty with me. I let them be nasty.
Well, and I always, when I'm editing a faculty's column, for instance, if they're really adamant on something, it's their name on the column, not mine. So.
Generally, and I mean, yeah, I'm sure we've all had that problem sometimes. Generally, I think even from the beginning, I remind people that, my job is to translate their research into something that would, to show the public why it's important. And they usually appreciate that process. Even if they don't totally get it, and you work with them and negotiate with them. But in the end, it is their story. That's how.
Yeah. Well, so Chris sent us the link to that app, which I'm going to check out. That's pretty cool.
Yeah, and the key to it is it took me a while to figure this out, and I kept thinking I couldn't figure out how to do it. What you do is that if you go to that link, there's this text it's below. It says Hemingway app makes your writing bold and clear. Actually, let me can I share my screen? I'm going to go ahead and see if I can share my screen.
There you go.
Can y'all see that?
Yeah.
So I was pulling my hair out because I was like, well, how? Because they say, well, just drop your text in. I'm like, well, where do I do it? I don't know. So it turns out it's here. What you do is you basically, you just delete this and then you put your piece of writing in there. It's kind of funny to utilize this type. So I'll show you, I'll go to this story I just wrote and I'll drop that into the app. So yeah, that's the key. I could not figure out how to get the piece. They said it's easy. You just put it in there. And I'm like, well, where do you put it in? But I finally figured out you just delete it. So what happens is, come on. What happens is that you just take that, you delete it, and then, or you just highlight, and then you just paste in. So this is the story I wrote, and it gets a grade 8. 850 words. So actually, that's on the longer side for me. But
thanks for that tip. I'm not sure I would have figured that out for a while.
Yeah. Well, the thing is that I don't really, to be honest with you, I mean, I've been writing for so long and I've had so many, I've read so many articles about writing and writing. I don't like go, oh my gosh, and I don't go line by line through here and go, oh, oh, this is a passive phrase. Yes, I understand that sometimes passive phrases are needed more than an active phrase or passive. But passive voice, I'm sorry, not phrase, passive voice. But anyway, so that's what happens. It gives you all this stuff on the side you can look at or not. I just basically look at this. Grade 8, good. But I don't make that the make or break. I do have colleagues who will put a draft in before they send it on for review. And it does help if it basically, but like I said, with a news release, it's probably going to get a grade 11 or 12. But the thing is with your audience, a news release is a media audience. It's when I got a news release.
That's a good point.
Yeah,
that's a really good point.
What I would tell them is basically like, if your news release is like an 11 or 12th grade audience or whatever, that's fine because your audience is media. It's not the public. And so it's their job to basically take your news release, which is full of the negotiated, some jargon, some not kind of thing, and take that and move that readability score down several grades. And so that's kind of like, they always forget it's the media is the release audience. It's not their colleagues. It's not their trade. It's not their peers. And so yeah, so that would be a good point to make if you're ever on a sticking point with something.
Yeah,
to the media.
I actually never thought of that, but then I was media for so long that those are my people.
Yeah, and I would use news releases, to be honest with you. Of course, when I was covering university, or I got, I didn't have a beat where except for when I was covering university where I got a lot of news releases. But typically I was writing the stories before I even got the release. So I would use the release to add a little bit of context, a little bit of background or something. It was usually much later in the story, but I never really took chunks out. But that's changed. I mean, that was more than 10 years ago. Well, actually, back when I was covering the university, it was like 10. Well, I did 2 different stints, but it's changed so much now where I've noticed that writers will tend to, newspaper reporters will tend to, I think because of their staffing is differently, they post stuff to the web now. I mean, I used to have a 6 o'clock writing deadline, 6 p.m. writing deadline. Now they're basically like, get that to us as soon as you can. And so they're just taking a release and they're putting a new lead on it, and they almost never interview the person. They just use the quotes and stuff. So
used to drive me crazy because the staff over at this university is really good, and almost all of them came from my newspaper. So they would send us a press release that was perfect in every way as a news story. I'm like, gosh, darn it, you're making my job harder. I have to rewrite something that's awesome, perfectly good, but they don't even bother rewriting anymore. There's no staff.
One of the first news releases I wrote when I switched from the paper to the university, I wrote it, and basically the business editor said, we can't do our own story because you've essentially written our story, and we're not going to run the news release. So that taught me that basically it isn't counterintuitive that you don't really want to write it so perfectly as a news story that they'll basically go. Now, again, that was 10 something years ago. So
today they'll run it.
Today they'll
they
run
don't
it.
have
We'll
any
just put
staff.
it right on there. I did want to say a little at the very beginning. You were talking about industry, and I did learn. I did learn fairly quickly. I didn't really write for the industry when I was at my other university, but this one I do because of extension stuff. But industry publications, I was sending some tips to them. They don't want tips. They want something that they want you to write it. They want you to write it. So that's actually a good. Way. When I say like I'm like, okay, I don't know if this really rises to a news release, but I'll send this tip to like Food Security Today or whatever. It was a food security magazine. And they're basically like, oh, no, I sent them the release. That's what it was. I did write a release and I sent it to them, and they wanted me to write like the 6 paragraphs to go in their trade publication. And I thought, oh my God, that's ridiculous. Do it yourself. I sent you the release. But you know what I did? I just basically plucked 6 paragraphs out of the release and I sent it to them. but industry, they were very, yeah. So that's, if you ever get that, where industry will basically say, we want a story. We want you to write it. I'm like, okay, well, if it's 6 paragraphs, then I can handle that, or 6 inches or whatever. It's so funny. I don't talk about inches anymore. I talk about words and paragraphs, whereas I never talked about it.
I mean, bringing this up, this is a question that I've had. I wondered about others too, but back when I was working in newspapers, I would write my own a lot, or modify news releases to localize them, etc., shorten them for the space that we had. But now we send out news releases. We seldom send out like media alerts or whatever, because they just use them, and they usually don't put our name on them. Sometimes they do. And I assume that with the changes in the industry and so many fewer people on news staffs, that's what they want. I'm curious to know, what others think about that.
Well, I know that if I used a news release almost verbatim, I would make sure it was obvious that it came from from the industry, from the source, and not from me. But at one point we only had one reporter, and one copy editor for the entire paper. So we were just desperate to get anything in. And I know that a lot of the reporters now are very young, very inexperienced. Especially in my market, there's a lot of specialized knowledge. Just, as far as even the weather, 0 degrees is not cold up here. And that just kind of throws people. If they're, plugging in your car, and just, the little things about living in an environment like this. And I'm sure it's the same in Iowa. It's the same in Oregon. I guess it rains in Oregon, and the wind blows in Iowa. Things like that. But as far as getting stuff out to people, I'm actually having trouble finding stories, just because there's nobody in the office. Everybody's still working remotely up here, and I've only been here 6 months, and so I'm sending emails. So what are you working on? Sometimes they answer me and sometimes they don't. So, but
Yeah, just real quick. One of the things that has been frustrating to me is between the staffing issue and younger reporters, email, you don't really have a relationships like you used to. You just don't. I mean, you don't. I mean, even when it was a somewhat adversarial relationship with the university comms team when I was covering university or schools, when I was covering schools, K through 12, you at least had a relationship. I mean, but now between email, shorter staffing, younger reporters who prefer email, if at most, I mean, they never want to get a call. They never want to talk to you.
Oh, my teenager won't talk on the phone at all.
Except for TV, TV that hasn't changed. TV, the younger reporters, of course, here in Oregon, other than Portland, we only have 2 other TV affiliates in the state, or I mean, cities that have affiliates. And so that's interesting because, those 2, like in Eugene and Bend, they're usually getting the ones right out of college. And so they're like, they're loaded for bear. I mean, they're like, they want to do all this stuff. And when we have done in-person faculty media training, most of the complaints were like, they came out for an hour and they used like 20 seconds. Well, most of the time that is what happens with TV. But on the other hand, I've told them, I said, a lot of them, if they're right out of college, they're working on what they call their reels. They're basically they want to make every story perfect because they want for their next job, they want to be, so I said, if a young TV reporter comes out and now they're like a 1-person, they do the camera and the thing. So they usually take more time because they really want to get, they're not like a veteran who basically gets in, does their stuff and leaves. But yeah, that relationship building, it's not, you can't even try anymore. I mean, it's just basically, there are a few that basically, like I had a like when I was covering ag, so we have the Capital Press here in the Northwest, which is basically just an ag only, actually print paper with a website. And I mean, there are times I would basically say, hey, I saw this on Facebook. I would send, like, one of our like programs would say, put something on, oh, this new bug or this new insect, this new pest we found in our orchard. And I would just like literally say, hey, I saw this on Facebook, and he would do a story about it. So that was good, but that's like about the only relationship I can build now.
One thing that happened here that I didn't do, but I actually would like to do in the future is our soybean research center did this, and it worked really well for cultivating some media relationships, because certainly what Chris is saying, we've seen too, for sure. But they invited the media, and they had short presentations by a number of people involved with soybean research and extension. And they got a really good turnout. That it was like 2 hours, and there were 15-minute presentations, 10 to 15, maybe 10 to 12. And we got a number of stories out of that. Plus, I've noticed that those research or those media people that were there are doing more stories about our work and paying more attention. And I got to talk to a bunch of them. And so I want to do that same sort of thing in the not too far future with just general researchers to highlight stories, great stories and impact here on campus.
Okay. I've got to shoot off for a minute. I've got a 10 o'clock coming up. I put my email up. I'm going to go ahead and set up a Dropbox and throw a story that I just wrote in it. If anybody wants to take a look, send me your email addresses and I can add you to the box. But I'm really interested to see what you all are working on, to see how my writing can be something that my mother doesn't recognize all the time. And just this has been really, really interesting. That's a great app, Chris. I think that's going to be really useful.
Yeah, I would just basically, my advice is to not take it for gospel. It's like it is a good guide, but I don't scrap my story because it's like an 11th grade reading level.
Yeah, and I use a word counter every so often, depending on what program I'm in, and it does about the same thing, but it's not quite as precise. You know, you're writing on a college level, nobody's going to understand you. But anyway, anything else from anybody?
I just want to say thank you for hosting this, Julie, and getting us all together. And if you're okay with it, if you want to write something up for the forum and our Facebook page, so that if anyone else wants to join as they're interested, if that would be okay.
That would be great. Yeah, it's good to see you all.
Thank you for